When historians describe the year 1871 in Chicago, they usually focus on the devastation above ground, the Great Fire that consumed block after block, the smoke that turned noon into twilight, the 300 lives lost, the 100,000 left homeless, and the 3 square miles reduced to ash and rubble. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one buried in engineering notes and quiet archival footnotes, did not begin above the surface. It began below it. The rebuilding order seemed straightforward: clear debris, stabilize foundations, determine whether the ground could support a new city rising from the ashes. Engineers, surveyors, and labor crews were dispatched across the burned district with practical instructions: remove wreckage, inspect soil conditions, and prepare the terrain for reconstruction. No one expected to find anything unusual, but within days of digging through the charred remains of basements and collapsed structures, workers broke through into voids that did not belong to any known building. Beneath cellar floors and foundation stones, deeper than any documented construction in the city, they found passageways. At first, the discovery was dismissed as old drainage works or incomplete sewer projects. Chicago had long struggled with flooding and sanitation. Unfinished tunnels were plausible, but the deeper the crews dug, the less plausible that explanation became. These were not crude channels carved in haste. The passageways were aligned with geometric precision. Their walls were smooth, their curvature consistent, their dimensions standardized in a way that suggested a unified design rather than piecemeal construction. And then they found the first platform. It emerged from the soil like the edge of a forgotten shoreline, a raised stone lip running parallel to a tunnel wall, perfectly level, perfectly straight, extending beyond the reach of lantern light. Workers stood beside it in silence, unsure what they were looking at. It did not resemble a basement, a sewer, or a freight tunnel. It resembled a station. The discovery was quietly noted in internal reports. Unforeseen tunnels, one entry read. Another, unexpected platform structures, origin unknown. The language was cautious, almost reluctant, as if naming the discovery too precisely might give it weight no one was prepared to carry. Public reconstruction reports never mentioned these features. Newspapers celebrated resilience, progress, and the speed at which the city would rise again. Above ground, Chicago's rebirth became a national symbol. Below ground, something far stranger was unfolding. Recovery photographs taken during debris removal, images intended to document insurance claims and structural conditions, captured glimpses of the subterranean network. Workers posed unknowingly beside platform edges cut with a precision that rivaled modern stonework. Tunnel walls appeared uniformly bored, not hand-carved, their surfaces too smooth to match the tools of the era. The scale defied the simplest explanations. If these were utility tunnels, why did they follow standardized dimensions across miles? If they were freight passages, why were their platforms clearly designed for boarding and disembarking? And if they were sewers, why were their profiles shaped with aerodynamic curves more suited to high-speed movement than water flow? The official narrative began forming almost immediately. Old utility passages, abandoned infrastructure, natural limestone caverns modified by early settlers. Nothing unusual, nothing worth public concern. But internal notes told a different story. Engineers struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Tunnel alignments were too precise for early excavation methods. Platform heights matched no known vehicle type. Some corridors extended far beyond the boundaries of any documented project. And perhaps most troubling of all, there were no records of who had built them. Chicago in 1871 was a young city, barely decades removed from its frontier origins. Its surface transit consisted of horse-drawn streetcars and rail lines laid hastily to meet explosive growth. Yet beneath its foundations appeared infrastructure designed for something faster, more efficient, more sophisticated than anything operating above ground. Recovery teams did not use words like lost technology. They were practical people, trained to measure, document, and rebuild. But in private correspondence and marginal notes, a different tone emerged, one of quiet dissonance. Someone had built a transit system here before. Not crude tunnels, not scattered passages, a system. As weeks passed, the documentation grew thinner, reports became shorter, descriptions shifted from precise measurements to vague summaries. Photographs stopped capturing full station chambers and instead focused on rubble and structural hazards. By late 1871, sections of the newly uncovered network were being filled again, packed with earth to support new foundations, sealed for safety, or simply left undocumented as construction moved forward. What had been briefly exposed to daylight was returning to darkness. Only fragments remained. Scattered photographs, partial notes, and the recollections of archivists who later claimed that some files vanished from municipal collections. Even from these fragments, a pattern was unmistakable. Stations too sophisticated for their supposed era, engineering too precise for accepted timelines, construction methods that looked inherited rather than invented. And as the city above rebuilt itself in record speed, the question no one publicly asked lingered beneath the streets. Was Chicago rising on virgin ground, or on top of something far older and far more advanced than anyone was willing to admit? Before we go deeper into what the recovery teams uncovered, the tunnel profiles, the propulsion systems, the deeper engineering anomalies, take a moment to consider how easily history can be shaped by what is recorded and what is quietly omitted. Because what came next did not simply challenge Chicago's past, it challenged the timeline of modern technology itself. When recovery teams pushed beyond the first recognizable basement layers beneath Chicago, their expectations remained grounded in routine engineering logic. They anticipated older foundations, utility corridors, perhaps remnants of pre-fire construction. Cities accumulate layers, that much was understood. What they uncovered instead did not behave like a normal city's underground. The first anomaly was systemization. Tunnel sections discovered beneath commercial districts matched those found miles away under residential neighborhoods. The same dimensions, the same curvature, the same structural ratios. In a typical urban environment, underground structures evolve over time. Different builders, different materials, different standards. Variation is the rule. But here, variation was absent. Platforms aligned across districts with uncanny precision, as if part of a single unified design. Track beds shared identical gauges despite being separated by layers of unrelated construction above. Junctions appeared in predictable intervals, suggesting a planned network rather than opportunistic expansion. It was as if every component belonged to an original system that no longer existed in any engineering record. As crews ventured deeper, the infrastructure became increasingly difficult to reconcile with 19th century capabilities. Larger tunnels appeared, not rough excavations, but smooth, aerodynamically shaped corridors that seemed optimized for airflow and speed. Their profiles resembled modern subway bores more than hand-dug passages. Some stations featured platform edges with tolerances so precise that gaps were nearly invisible. Archways held perfect curves without the irregularities typical of stone masonry. Even skeptics among the engineers admitted that the workmanship exceeded what contemporary tools should have allowed. Then came the discovery that unsettled even the most conservative observers. Embedded within several track beds were precisely wound metallic coils, not random scrap, but organized assemblies integrated into the infrastructure itself. Magnetic alignment components appeared at regular intervals, forming patterns that suggested propulsion guidance rather than structural reinforcement. This was not simple ironwork. It resembled electromagnetic infrastructure. Yet Chicago had no documented electrical transit system in 1871. Public electrification itself was still years away. No municipal plans, patents, or engineering journals from the era described magnetic rail guidance or electrically powered underground transport. And still, the components were there. Recovery photographs show workers standing beside these features, unaware of the implications. Coils embedded in stone, conduits arranged in symmetrical grids, junction housings that looked less like drainage controls and more like switching mechanisms. Transit engineers who have studied these images in later decades often remark on the same detail. The geometry is purposeful. Curves and grades appear calculated for smooth, high-speed movement. Tunnel slopes maintain consistent gradients suitable for powered transit rather than animal-drawn vehicles. Ventilation shafts align at intervals that make sense for passenger airflow, not sewage management. Even the wear patterns tell a story. Certain platform surfaces show polishing consistent with heavy foot traffic over extended periods. Edges are rounded in ways that suggest repeated boarding and disembarking. These are not untouched relics, they are infrastructure that appears to have been used. But by whom? And when? The official reports that followed the fire barely mentioned these anomalies. Some station chambers were omitted entirely from reconstruction maps. Complex tunnel systems were summarized with phrases like old passages or earlier excavations, language that concealed more than it revealed. The silence was not accidental. It was systematic. Because if these discoveries truly belonged to known historical periods, they would have been documented in detail. Municipal pride alone would have demanded it. Instead, photographs were scattered across private collections. Notes remained incomplete. Some diagrams appear to have been altered or simplified. Even the track components raised red flags. Rails too precise for blacksmith fabrication, switch mechanisms too complex for manual operation, junctions engineered with tolerances that suggested machine tooling beyond the era's capabilities. The deeper the teams explored, the harder it became to fit these findings into a clean, linear narrative of Chicago's development. Tunnel by tunnel, the ground beneath the city began to resemble a buried transportation network, a system built, operated, and deliberately sealed long before the fire exposed it. And then came the stations that defied categorization. These were not crude platforms carved into rock. They were geometrically exact chambers with symmetrical layouts and consistent proportions, as if designed according to architectural standards no one could identify. Some were sealed so completely that workers initially believed they had struck bedrock. When opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted tile, mounting points for equipment whose purpose could only be guessed. Among the most puzzling features were large flat stone panels positioned above platform level. Officially labeled as decorative elements in later summaries, they bore mounting brackets and alignment marks that suggested they once held mechanical or illuminated displays. Workers in private letters described them differently. Schedule markers, one called them. Boards for departures, wrote another. Information systems. Ventilation infrastructure presented another anomaly. These were not simple air shafts, but aerodynamically shaped channels placed at intervals consistent with high-capacity passenger flow. Their distribution suggested environmental control, temperature regulation, and air circulation for a volume of travelers far beyond anything Chicago's surface transit could have generated. It introduced an unsettling possibility. The buildings above ground might not simply rest on old foundations. They might sit atop a transit network designed for a population and a mobility demand never recorded in the city's history. The deeper the crews explored, the more the findings resisted conventional explanation. Some tiled surfaces were made from materials that contemporary chemists could not identify. Certain conduits contained metallic compositions unfamiliar to 19th-century metallurgy. Power distribution channels appeared in systematic grids beneath platforms, arranged as if to deliver energy to a network that no longer operated. The official explanation, old gas lines, mineral deposits, failed to account for their deliberate layout. That level of infrastructure requires planning. It requires an energy source. It requires a purpose. Soon after these discoveries accumulated, a pattern emerged in the recovery operation. Stations containing the most anomalous technology were filled first. Tunnels with electromagnetic components were sealed. Ventilation networks extending beyond excavation zones were blocked. Officially, these actions were justified as safety measures necessary to support new construction. But observers noted a consistent detail. The spaces closed most quickly were also the most structurally sound and technologically complex. The exploration did not conclude. It stopped. And as the final weeks of 1871 approached, the tone of internal notes shifted. Early entries had been confident, methodical, precise. Later ones became cautious, vague, and incomplete, as if someone else had begun deciding what could be written and what must remain unrecorded. Because what the workers uncovered next would push the discoveries beyond engineering anomalies into something far more difficult to explain. By the final weeks of the 1871 recovery, the excavations beneath Chicago had revealed enough to raise questions no official report could comfortably answer. The deepest stations, the ones with the most precise construction, the most advanced components, the clearest signs of organized transit, were the first to disappear. Platform chambers were filled, tunnel mouths were collapsed, access points were sealed beneath new foundations as the rebuilt city rose above them. The explanation was simple: safety, stability, deadlines. But the pattern was not. Unstable voids remained open while structurally sound stations were buried. Ordinary passages were mapped while complex junctions vanished from surveys. Photographs that once showed full chambers were replaced with cropped images of rubble and support beams. The exploration did not conclude. It reached a boundary. In the fragments that survived, a handful of photographs, partial diagrams, and guarded correspondence, the same impression repeats. Infrastructure too precise for its supposed era, systems too integrated to be accidental, and engineering that looks inherited rather than invented. If the network beneath Chicago was merely abandoned utility work, it would have been studied, repurposed, and celebrated as a triumph of early urban planning. Instead, it was sealed and forgotten. And that choice leaves us with the question that still lingers beneath the streets. What if the fire did not reveal the beginning of Chicago's story, but a buried chapter of something far older? Because if a modern city can be built atop a transit system no one officially acknowledges, then the mystery is no longer confined to one place or one year. It becomes a broader possibility that beneath other cities, beneath other disasters and reconstructions, similar layers wait in darkness. Not ruins in the traditional sense, but infrastructure, systems, evidence of a technological past that does not fit the timeline we were taught. The 1871 excavations offer